sometimes the most unexpected heroes are found in the quiet spaces of ordinary life, a hospital room, a child's innocent smile, or the silent courage of someone who refuses to give up. Dr. Camille Brooks is a dedicated pediatrician who's no stranger to long hours and heavy burdens. Skilled, compassionate, and endlessly resilient, she spent her career mending little bodies and soothing worried hearts. But when 5-year-old Jackson Miller is brought to her care, his bright spirit shines a light into places long hidden, revealing truths both simple and uncomfortable. Jackson is innocent, trusting, and full of joy. He doesn't see the world through the same jaded eyes as his parents, Greg and Laura Miller, who carry a prejudice that lingers in every glance and every word unspoken. To them, Dr. Camille's presence is a challenge, a crack in their carefully constructed walls. But as Jackson grows stronger under Camille's care, his parents begin to witness something they can't ignore: kindness, perseverance, and a quiet strength they never expected. This story is about more than saving a life. It's about breaking barriers, one moment of humanity at a time. It's about the light that children carry into the darkest corners of the world, and how that light can change even the most guarded hearts. What happens when a small boy's innocence collides with his parents' deeply rooted doubts? Can compassion, patience, and hope really bridge divides that feel impossible to cross? The rhythmic hum of the hospital blended into the distant echoes of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps. It was the kind of background noise that Dr. Camille Brooks had grown so used to over the years. She could hear it without really listening. To her, the hospital was more than a place of work. It was where she belonged, even if it rarely felt welcoming. Camille sat at her desk in her small office, the early morning light struggling through the blinds. The walls were sparsely decorated degrees in dark frames, a faded photograph of her parents, and a child's drawing pinned to a corkboard that read, "Thank you, Dr. Camille," in shaky handwriting. That one reminded her why she kept coming back. It was her anchor on days when the world pressed too hard on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a gentle vibration breaking the quiet. The message was brief. Room 305. Jackson Miller. Respiratory distress. Stable for now. Camille stood, smoothing her lab coat with careful hands, and left the office. When she walked into room 305, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. The small boy in the hospital bed, Jackson Miller, looked impossibly tiny against the stark white sheets. His curly brown hair was damp with sweat, his little chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He clutched a stuffed bear, its fur worn thin in spots. Camille softened her expression as she approached the bed. "Hi there," she said warmly, crouching so that her eyes met his. "You must be Jackson." The boy turned his head toward her, his dark brown eyes wide with curiosity. Despite the nasal cannula helping him breathe, he managed a small smile. "You are the doctor?" His voice was raspy but full of wonder, as if he had expected someone far less human and more machine-like. "Yes, I am. My name is Dr. Camille Brooks, but you can call me Dr. Camille." She smiled back. "Dr. Camille," Jackson repeated carefully, stumbling over the syllables. His grin stretched wider. "That is a nice name." Behind her, the boy's parents stood stiff and silent. Camille didn't need to turn around to know they were watching her every move. She could feel the weight of their stares like a cold breeze against her skin. It was not the usual nervousness of parents with a sick child. It was sharper, laced with suspicion. Camille rose slowly to her feet, her expression remaining calm. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she said, turning to face them. "I will be overseeing Jackson's treatment. He is stable for now, but I will need to run some tests and monitor his progress closely." Laura Miller, Jackson's mother, was a tall, thin woman with light blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. She nodded curtly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Is there anything we should be worried about?" Laura asked. Her tone was polite, but there was something guarded about the way she spoke. "I will know more after the tests, but for now, Jackson is in good hands." Camille's voice was steady, rehearsed. She had said those words countless times before. Greg Miller, Jackson's father, remained silent. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by years of hard labor, his jaw perpetually clenched. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Camille like he was looking through her, rather than at her. "Will there be another doctor coming in?" Greg asked abruptly. His voice was rough, like gravel beneath boots. Camille froze for half a second before recovering. She had heard this before, different words, same meaning. "Are you the best we can get?" "I am the attending physician for Jackson's case," Camille replied evenly. "I assure you, he is receiving the best care possible." Greg looked as though he wanted to say something more, but Laura placed a hand on his arm. He fell silent. Camille turned back to Jackson, her voice gentle once again. "We are going to take such good care of you, Jackson. I need you to be strong for me, okay?" Jackson's smile returned, chasing away the shadows. "I can do that," he said proudly. "That is my brave boy," Camille whispered, reaching out to adjust the blanket around his shoulders. As she straightened, Camille caught Laura's narrowed gaze and Greg's rigid stance. It stung, the way they looked at her, but Camille had long ago learned how to bury those feelings beneath layers of professionalism. "Focus on the patient," she reminded herself. "The rest does not matter." When Camille stepped out of the room, her carefully composed mask slipped just a little. She exhaled slowly, leaning against the wall outside room 305. The hallway buzzed with life nurses rushing by, carts squeaking across the linoleum floors, phones ringing, but all she could feel was the icy tension she had left behind. Her mind wandered back to the look in Greg Miller's eyes. She had seen it before. It was the look of someone who had already decided who she was before she even spoke a word. It hurt, though she had grown skilled at ignoring it. "Dr. Brooks?" Camille glanced up to see Nurse Evelyn Parker approaching, a knowing look on her face. Evelyn was older, in her late 50s, with a round face and silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun. She had been at the hospital longer than anyone, and nothing seemed to surprise her. "How is he doing?" Evelyn asked, falling into step beside Camille. "Stable for now," Camille replied. "I am ordering tests to figure out what is causing his respiratory distress. He is strong for a little guy." Evelyn nodded, her tone turning soft. "And the parents?" Camille paused, choosing her words carefully. "They are concerned." Evelyn snorted quietly, understanding immediately. "Concerned, huh? Is that what we are calling it now?" Camille managed a faint smile, appreciating Evelyn's blunt honesty. "It does not matter," Camille said finally. "Jackson matters. That is what I am here for." Evelyn patted her arm. "I know that, and you know that. Just do what you always do. Let the rest fall where it may." Camille nodded, but as she walked toward the nurse's station to update Jackson's charts, her thoughts lingered. It was not the first time she had been in a situation like this. Prejudice had a way of sneaking into sterile hospital rooms, even when lives hung in the balance. It was in the small comments, the quick glances, the questions that were never asked of other doctors. Camille had worked twice as hard, been twice as careful, just to get where she was. And still, sometimes, it was not enough. As she filled in Jackson's chart, she reminded herself why she did this work. It was not for parents like Greg Miller or the doubts they carried. It was for children like Jackson children who looked at her with eyes full of trust and wonder. Hours later, Camille returned to room 305 to check on Jackson. He was awake, his little fingers busy drawing on a coloring book that one of the nurses had brought him. His parents were quiet, seated in the corner of the room like statues. Jackson looked up and beamed. "Dr. Camille, look, I made you something." He held up a page he had colored an imperfect picture of a smiling woman in a white coat. Camille's heart softened. "Is that me?" she asked, crouching next to him. "Yes," Jackson exclaimed. "You are my hero doctor." For the first time, Camille allowed herself to smile freely, the warmth of Jackson's words pushing back the cold. Behind her, she felt Greg's eyes on her again. When she turned, she caught the briefest flicker of something confusion, maybe even curiosity, before his expression hardened once more. Camille straightened, tucking the drawing into her pocket. "Thank you, Jackson. That means the world to me." She left the room with a little lighter in her heart. It was moments like this that reminded her why she stayed. Jackson did not care what the world taught him to see. He only saw kindness. And sometimes, Camille thought, maybe that was enough. Camille stood by the nurse's station, the soft hum of hospital life surrounding her. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, glancing over Jackson Miller's latest test results. His condition remained stable, though the respiratory irregularities pointed to an underlying infection they had yet to pinpoint. There was no time for assumptions in this line of work. Every test brought answers closer. Evelyn approached her, clutching a clipboard. "How's the little guy holding up?" "Still smiling," Camille said, a faint smile of her own tugging at the corners of her lips. "But I need to keep a close eye on him. His results are borderline. It might get worse before it gets better." Evelyn nodded knowingly. "And the parents?" Camille sighed, lowering her coffee cup. "Still watching me like I might drop their child." Evelyn clicked her tongue. "They will come around? They always do when they see how good you are at what you do." "Maybe." Camille stared into the bottom of her cup, as though the answer might float up to meet her. "Maybe not." Back in room 305, the tension was thick as ever. Laura Miller sat by Jackson's bedside, flipping through a glossy magazine, though her eyes barely skimmed the pages. Greg stood by the window with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the parking lot below. Jackson noticed Camille first. "Dr. Camille," he called, sitting up straighter. "Hey, Jackson," Camille greeted, her voice light as she walked to his side. She noted his color still pale, but improving. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Jackson replied brightly, though his voice was faint. He pointed to his stuffed bear, who now wore a piece of gauze wrapped around its middle. "Mr. Bear had surgery too." Camille chuckled softly. "You are an excellent doctor." "You're better," Jackson said with certainty. "You're the real hero, doctor." Camille's smile lingered as she checked his vitals, though she could feel Laura's gaze on her back like a needle. Greg shifted near the window, his movements slow and deliberate. "His numbers are looking better," Camille said gently, addressing Laura. "The antibiotics are helping, but we need to complete the full course to make sure the infection clears." Laura nodded stiffly. "How soon can we take him home?" "It depends on how he responds over the next few days. We are monitoring him closely." Laura hesitated, her voice faltering. "I want to know he's in the best hands." Camille turned to face her, her expression steady and calm. "Mrs. Miller, I have been treating children for years. Your son is in the best hands. I promise you that." Laura's mouth opened, but whatever response she had vanished. She looked away, staring at the magazine in her lap. Greg spoke for the first time, his voice clipped and low. "I just want this over with." Camille's chest tightened, though her face remained neutral. She had dealt with this before many times, in fact. Still, no matter how many years passed, prejudice always had a way of finding her in moments like this. It was exhausting, like being forced to prove herself again and again. "You have my word," she said evenly, her voice betraying none of the emotions swirling beneath. "Everything I do is to make sure Jackson gets better." She turned her attention back to Jackson, her tone immediately lighter. "You rest up, buddy. I will check on you again soon, all right?" "Okay," Jackson said, grinning at her. "Will you bring more stickers?" Camille laughed softly. "You bet I will." Outside the room, Camille's steps slowed as the door closed behind her. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The weight of Greg Miller's words pressed down on her, not because they were new, but because they were familiar, too familiar. She thought of her parents, her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to support Camille's dreams, and her father, who always told her, "Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt." Camille had carried that advice through every stage of her life, from med school to residency and now to her role as a respected pediatrician. But sometimes, like today, the doubt was still there, silent, like an invisible wall that separated her from people like Greg Miller. "Dr. Brooks?" Camille opened her eyes to see Evelyn approaching, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "Thanks, Evelyn," Camille murmured, taking the cup. Evelyn's sharp gaze studied her for a moment. "I take it things are no better in there." Camille exhaled slowly. "No, they keep their distance." "You have nothing to prove to those people," Evelyn said firmly. "I know," Camille replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is not about them anyway. It is about Jackson." Evelyn nodded approvingly. "That is why you are the best doctor here. Remember that." Camille smiled faintly, the warmth of Evelyn's words settling over her like a light blanket. She clung to it as she returned to her rounds, letting the routine distract her from the lingering tension. Late that night, after her shift ended, Camille sat in her office, staring at Jackson's drawing pinned to the corkboard. In it, she wore a bright white coat, a smile as wide as the sun. The simplicity of it reminded her of how children saw the world untainted, unfiltered, free of the burdens their parents carried. Jackson didn't care what Camille looked like, where she came from, or how others saw her. To him, she was the doctor who made him feel safe, and that was all that mattered. Camille traced a finger over the edge of the drawing, then opened her journal. Writing had always been her refuge, a place to unpack her thoughts when the world became too heavy. "I met Jackson today. He is 5, bright-eyed, and full of wonder. He calls me his hero doctor. And for him, I will be just that. I will not let his parents' doubt define me, not today, not ever. Jackson sees me for who I am, and maybe one day his parents will see that too. For now, I will let my work speak for itself." She closed the journal and turned off her desk lamp, the room plunging into soft shadows. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Camille looked up at the dark sky. Stars scattered across the horizon, barely visible against the glow of the city lights. She thought of Jackson's smile, of his trust, and of the small kindness she had received from Evelyn earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that perseverance was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that built bridges where walls once stood. Camille returned to room 305 with a small pack of stickers tucked into her pocket. Jackson's eyes lit up when he saw her, his little hands reaching out eagerly. "You brought them!" he exclaimed. "Of course I did," Camille said, kneeling beside him and laying the stickers out on his blanket. "You earned these, Jackson. You have been so brave." Greg and Laura sat silently in the corner, their expressions guarded. Camille caught Greg watching her, though he quickly looked away when their eyes met. "Thank you," Laura said softly, surprising Camille. Camille glanced at her, nodding once. "It is my job." But as Jackson pressed a sparkly sticker onto her hand, giggling at the glittery dinosaur, Camille felt something shift just a little. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Sometimes change started with the tiniest of cracks. "See?" Jackson said, pointing at the sticker. "Now you are a hero doctor and a glitter doctor." Camille laughed. "I will take it." As she stood to leave, she felt Greg's eyes on her again. This time, he didn't look away. For a fleeting moment, Camille thought she saw something different. Confusion, maybe even curiosity. It was a start. The morning light filtered through the blinds in room 305, casting soft stripes across Jackson's sleeping face. Camille stood quietly at his bedside, her stethoscope pressed gently to his small chest. His breaths, though uneven, were clearer than before, a step in the right direction. "Lungs sound better today, buddy," she whispered, as though not to disturb the calm. Jackson stirred slightly, his stuffed bear still clutched to his side. Camille smiled faintly. The room was peaceful now, but she knew that peace was temporary. There were things beyond Jackson's innocence that could unsettle her morning. As Camille turned to update his chart, the door creaked open behind her. Laura Miller stepped in, her blonde hair loose for the first time, framing her tired face. "Good morning," Camille said quietly, maintaining her calm professionalism. Laura nodded, hesitant. She moved to stand beside Jackson's bed, watching her son as if he might disappear if she looked away. The quiet hung heavy between them until Laura finally broke it. "Is he improving?" Camille glanced at her, gauging her tone. "Yes," she said. "His lungs are responding well to the antibiotics, but I want to keep him here a bit longer to monitor for any changes." Laura nodded again, her eyes softening just slightly as she reached out to smooth Jackson's blanket. "You have a child's touch," she murmured unexpectedly. "He likes you." Camille paused, surprised. "Jackson is easy to like. He is brave and bright a fighter." Laura didn't reply, her gaze distant as she brushed a hand over Jackson's curls. For a moment, Camille saw something beyond the guarded walls, the vulnerability of a mother afraid of losing her child. It was a reminder that people like Laura, no matter their prejudice, were still human. "I will be back later," Camille said gently, before slipping out of the room. By mid-morning, Jackson was wide awake and sitting up in bed, surrounded by a small army of coloring books and toys that the nurses had brought in. Camille entered the room with her usual light knock, smiling when Jackson greeted her with enthusiasm. "Dr. Camille," he called, waving her over. "Look at my pictures." She crossed the room, crouching down to see his latest masterpiece, a rainbow-colored dinosaur with wobbly legs. "This one is my favorite," she said, pointing at the bright green head. "It is for you," Jackson beamed, holding out the paper with both hands. Camille took the drawing as though it were a priceless treasure. "Thank you, Jackson. I am going to hang this in my office." Jackson's grin widened, and for a brief moment, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. Here, in his innocent joy, Camille found a quiet kind of refuge. Greg Miller, however, shattered the moment. He had been sitting silently in the corner, but now he shifted and cleared his throat. "Jackson," Greg said, his tone gruff, "did you finish your breakfast like we told you?" Jackson blinked at his father and shook his head. "Not yet." "Well, you need to eat if you want to get better." Camille stood, carefully tucking the drawing into her coat pocket. Greg's eyes briefly flicked to her before he turned his attention back to his son. "Daddy says I am strong," Jackson said proudly, "like a big bear." "You are," Camille agreed, her voice light. "But even bears need their strength. So let's finish breakfast, okay?" Jackson nodded, but his expression turned thoughtful. "Daddy says we do not trust people we do not know." The words hung in the air like a sudden chill. Camille froze, feeling the weight of the statement sink into her chest. Greg's eyes shot up, his expression going rigid, but Jackson remained blissfully unaware of the tension he had caused. "Did I say something wrong?" Jackson asked, his small brow furrowing. "No, sweet boy," Camille said softly, finding her voice. "You didn't do anything wrong." Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Laura, who had entered just in time to hear the exchange, stood frozen by the door. Her face paled as her eyes darted between Camille and her husband. "Jackson, why don't we work on that breakfast?" Camille said, her tone steady and kind. Jackson nodded obediently, picking up his spoon and turning back to his tray. Camille glanced at Greg, their eyes locking for a fleeting moment. His face was unreadable, but Camille knew the tension that simmered beneath. "I will check on you later," she told Jackson gently, before turning to leave. Outside the room, Camille leaned against the wall, her hands resting in her coat pockets. She pressed her fingers against the folded drawing Jackson had given her, as if the crumpled paper could steady her. Those words, "We do not trust people we do not know," echoed in her head. They were innocent coming from Jackson, a mere repetition of what he had heard. But the source, she knew, came from the people meant to teach him better. "Camille?" She looked up to see Evelyn approaching, her brow furrowed with concern. "What happened?" Camille exhaled slowly, straightening herself. "Nothing." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Your face says otherwise." Camille hesitated, her voice quieter this time. "Jackson repeated something his father must have said, something about not trusting people they do not know." Evelyn sighed heavily. "Kids repeat everything they hear." "I know." Camille's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "It is not his fault. He is just a child." Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Camille's arm. "Children may repeat what they hear, but they believe what they see. Jackson sees you, Camille. He trusts you. That matters." Camille nodded faintly. "I just wonder if it is enough." "It is," Evelyn said firmly. "You just keep doing your job. People like the Millers, sometimes they learn, sometimes they don't. But Jackson, he has a chance to see the world differently because of you." Camille didn't respond, but Evelyn's words stayed with her as she walked back to her office. She sat at her desk, pulling Jackson's drawing from her pocket. The colorful dinosaur looked back at her with its silly smile, as if it held no idea of the world's complexities. She taped it to the wall next to the other children's drawings. Later that afternoon, Camille returned to Jackson's room to find him awake, sitting up straighter than he had all day. He grinned when he saw her. "Dr. Camille, Mommy said you are the best doctor." Camille raised an eyebrow, glancing at Laura, who was seated nearby. Laura flushed, looking down at her lap. "I did not exactly say that," she mumbled. Camille chose to ignore the awkwardness and smiled at Jackson. "Your mom is right. You are in good hands." Jackson nodded enthusiastically. "You know what, Dr. Camille?" "What's that?" "I think Mr. Bear likes you too." Camille laughed softly, the sound genuine. "Well, I like Mr. Bear." Laura looked up, her expression unreadable. But Camille noticed how her gaze lingered on the drawing of Jackson's dinosaur, now pinned proudly to Camille's coat pocket. "Thank you," Laura said quietly. Camille turned, surprised. "For what?" "For taking care of him," Laura said, her voice softer than before. "No matter what." Camille held Laura's gaze for a moment before offering a small nod. "It is my job," Camille said simply. But the truth was deeper than that. As she turned back to Jackson, who was happily telling Mr. Bear a story, Camille allowed herself to hope just a little that the cracks were beginning to show. The late afternoon sunlight cast a warm glow across room 305. Jackson lay on his side, dozing softly, his small hand resting protectively on his stuffed bear. Camille stood by his bed, flipping through his chart and noting the steady improvement. The numbers were finally moving in the right direction. His lungs were clearer, his fever had broken, and his body was responding well to the antibiotics. "Good boy, Jackson," Camille whispered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She reached down, carefully tucking the blanket around him. The quiet was interrupted by the door creaking open. Camille turned her head slightly as Greg Miller entered, holding a paper cup of coffee. He hesitated at the doorway, his broad frame momentarily silhouetted in the light, before stepping inside. Camille straightened, masking her surprise. It was rare to see Greg without Laura by his side. She had always been the one to ask the questions, her manner cold but polite, while Greg lingered in the background, arms crossed and gaze sharp. Greg cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "How's he doing?" Camille turned back to the chart, speaking evenly. "He is improving. The antibiotics are working, and his breathing has stabilized. We will need to keep him a couple more days to be sure the infection is completely gone." Greg nodded once, his gaze dropping to the floor. He lingered at the foot of the bed, watching Jackson sleep. Camille felt the tension in the room, heavy and unspoken. She had grown used to the way Greg avoided eye contact, as though meeting her gaze might break something fragile. But today, he seemed different, quieter, more uncertain. After a long pause, Greg spoke again. "He likes you, you know." Camille turned, surprised. Greg's voice was low and rough, but there was something else in it, something softer. "I am glad," Camille replied simply. Greg's eyes remained fixed on his son. "He talks about you, says you are his hero, doctor." The words settled between them, and Camille didn't quite know how to respond. She could still hear Jackson's innocent voice from earlier that morning, repeating what his father had said about trust. Yet here Greg stood, his edges less sharp, his voice less guarded. "Jackson is a strong boy," Camille said finally, her voice gentle. "He is brave, and he has a lot of people who care about him." Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the coffee cup. "He is all we have." Camille studied him for a moment, her heart softening despite herself. Beneath Greg's rough exterior, she caught a glimpse of the man he was, just a father, terrified of losing his child. It didn't excuse his prejudice, but it made him human. "He is in good hands," Camille said quietly. "I promise you that." Greg's jaw twitched as though he wanted to say more, but the words never came. Instead, he nodded stiffly and turned toward the door. That evening, as Camille sat at her desk, she replayed the brief exchange with Greg in her mind. It wasn't much, just a handful of words, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the armor he wore so tightly, and Camille couldn't help but wonder if it would widen in time. She glanced at Jackson's latest drawing, now pinned beside her other keepsakes. It was bright and cheerful, as though Jackson had colored it with his entire heart. Camille traced the outline of the crooked rainbow and smiled. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. "Hey, Camille, it's Evelyn. I am down here in the break room. You need a break?" Camille hesitated, then smiled faintly. "On my way." The break room was quiet when Camille entered, save for the low hum of the vending machine and Evelyn's voice filling the space. Evelyn sat at the small round table, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. "Look who finally decided to take a break," Evelyn teased, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Camille chuckled softly, setting her coffee down as she slid into the seat. "It's been one of those days." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You look like you have something on your mind." Camille sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Jackson's father, Greg. He talked to me today." Evelyn tilted her head. "Talked to you?" "Sort of." Camille paused, choosing her words carefully. "It wasn't much, but it felt different. Like maybe he's starting to see me." Evelyn studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it just takes one moment for people to realize they've been wrong. A lot of them never admit it, but they feel it." "Maybe," Camille said quietly. "I just wish it didn't take so much." Evelyn nodded, her voice soft. "It shouldn't, but you keep showing up anyway. That's what matters." Camille looked down at her coffee, a wave of exhaustion sweeping over her. "Sometimes it feels like pushing a boulder uphill." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And yet you keep climbing. That's why you're still here, Camille. That's why you make a difference." Camille didn't respond, but the warmth in Evelyn's words settled deep in her chest. The next morning, Camille returned to Jackson's room to find him sitting up, grinning as he colored in his book. Laura sat beside him, while Greg lingered near the window, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Good morning, Jackson," Camille greeted, her voice light as she approached. "Dr. Camille," Jackson beamed. "Look, I made a picture for you." He held up a drawing of a doctor with a bright white coat and curly hair that looked suspiciously like Camille's. She laughed softly, taking the picture as though it were a masterpiece. "This is perfect, Jackson. Thank you so much." Greg shifted by the window, his shoulders stiffening, but he said nothing. Laura cleared her throat, glancing at Camille. "How's he doing today?" "He is improving every day," Camille replied, turning back to Jackson's chart. "If he keeps this up, he might even get to go home soon." "Really?" Jackson asked, his face lighting up. "Yes, really," Camille said with a smile. Laura's expression softened as she looked at her son. "That's good to hear. Thank you, Dr. Brooks." Camille paused for a moment, hearing the sincerity in Laura's voice. "It's my pleasure." As she turned to leave, Greg's voice stopped her. "Doctor." Camille turned slowly, surprised. Greg's gaze was steady, though his expression remained guarded. "Thank you," he said gruffly. Camille held his gaze for a beat, her chest tightening. "You're welcome." She stepped into the hallway, her heart a little lighter than before. The cracks were small, but they were there, and sometimes cracks were all it took for light to get through. That evening, as Camille sat at her desk, she picked up Jackson's newest drawing and pinned it beside the others. Her wall of bright, imperfect pictures was growing, each one a reminder of why she kept going. Outside, the sky darkened as the city hummed with life. Camille leaned back in her chair, her thoughts lingering on Greg's quiet words. It was just a thank you, but it was more than she had expected. "Sometimes it just takes one moment," Evelyn had said. Camille allowed herself to hope that this was the beginning of something new, not just for Jackson's parents, but for Jackson himself. Maybe he would grow up seeing the world differently, unburdened by the walls his parents had built. She smiled softly, feeling the weight of the day melt away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubts, but she would face them, just as she always had. Because for children like Jackson, the light was always worth chasing. The early morning in the hospital was a quiet hum of beginnings machines clicking, wheels squeaking across floors, nurses shuffling with charts in hand. For Camille, this rhythm was a constant, grounding her in the familiar flow of life in small spaces. She entered room 305 to check on Jackson, carrying a small bag of colorful stickers she had promised the day before. "Good morning, Jackson," Camille greeted softly. Jackson's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. He sat up straighter, his stuffed bear tucked under his arm. "Dr. Camille, you brought them." "I always keep my promises," she said warmly, kneeling by his bedside and spreading the stickers out in front of him. "What do you think? Dinosaurs, superheroes, or puppies?" Jackson scrunched his face in thought before pointing decisively. "Dinosaurs." "Good choice." Camille handed him a sparkly green one shaped like a triceratops. As Jackson carefully stuck it to the edge of his coloring book, Camille noted his rosy cheeks and steady breathing. He was stronger today, a little more vibrant, his energy returning piece by piece. "Your lungs are sounding much better, Jackson," Camille told him after finishing her exam. Jackson grinned, his little chest puffing up with pride. "I knew I was strong like a bear." "You sure are," Camille agreed, rising to her feet. She turned to see Laura Miller standing quietly in the corner. Laura had been different in recent days, less cold, less wary. Now, her shoulders seemed to carry the weariness of a mother clinging to hope. She moved closer to Jackson's bed, glancing briefly at Camille. "How soon do you think he can go home?" Laura asked, her voice softer than before. "If everything continues this way, a couple more days," Camille said. "We want to be certain his lungs are completely clear. I know it is hard to wait, but we're getting there." Laura nodded, her gaze dropping to Jackson, who was busy lining his stickers up like soldiers in formation. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her words halting. She hesitated. I brought you something. Camille blinked, surprised. Brought me something? Laura reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a small, neatly folded paper bag. She extended it toward Camille, avoiding eye contact. It's just coffee. I figured you might need it. For a moment, Camille didn't move. It was such a small gesture, a cup of coffee, but it caught her completely off guard. Thank you, Camille said finally, her voice soft. She accepted the bag, feeling its warmth. Laura offered a faint nod and quickly turned her attention back to Jackson. Camille lingered for just a moment, taking in the quiet scene, Jackson humming to himself, Laura smoothing his blankets, the room momentarily free of tension. Out in the hallway, Camille leaned against the wall, cradling the paper cup in her hands. The smell of coffee, strong and familiar, filled the space between her thoughts. She couldn't remember the last time someone like Laura Miller had offered her something so simple. Small kindnesses, Camille thought, can feel enormous when you least expect them. The door to room 305 opened, and Greg Miller stepped out. He spotted Camille immediately, his expression as unreadable as ever. Morning, Greg said stiffly. Camille nodded. Good morning. Greg shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to the cup in her hands before meeting her gaze. Laura brought that? She did, Camille said, surprised he'd noticed. Greg exhaled, his mouth twitching as though he were chewing on his thoughts. He glanced back toward the room, his shoulders slightly less rigid than usual. Jackson seems better today, Greg said finally. He is. He's strong, like he says. You should be proud. Greg nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. He didn't say anything else, but for the first time, he didn't rush to put distance between them. Instead, he lingered for a few beats longer before walking away. Camille watched him go, the tension in her chest loosening just a little. Small cracks, small kindnesses. Later that afternoon, Camille sat at her desk reviewing Jackson's latest lab results. They confirmed what she had hoped: his infection was clearing. She would need to run one more test in the morning, but if his progress held steady, Jackson would go home soon. The thought brought a mixture of relief and something close to sadness. Jackson's innocent smile, his trust it had been a rare kind of light during difficult days. He reminded her of why she chose this path, even when the work felt uphill. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Come in. Evelyn entered, holding 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. Thought you could use lunch. Camille smiled. You are the best, Evelyn. Do not forget it, Evelyn replied, sliding into the chair across from her. How's Jackson? Improving, Camille said, her smile lingering. He'll probably go home soon. That's good to hear, Evelyn said, unwrapping her sandwich. And the parents? Camille paused, thoughtful. Laura brought me coffee today. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Coffee? Camille nodded. She didn't say much, just handed it to me. Evelyn chewed for a moment, clearly processing. Well, that's something, isn't it? Even small steps matter. They do, Camille agreed softly. They really do. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone more serious. You know, Camille, people like the Millers might not change overnight. Heck, maybe not at all. But sometimes people see you doing your work, your best work, and it shifts something. They start to question what they thought they knew. Maybe, Camille said. I'm not holding my breath, though. Evelyn smiled knowingly. You don't have to. You just keep showing up. Camille nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. That evening, as Camille prepared to leave for the day, she made one last stop in Jackson's room. The lights were dimmed, and Laura sat dozing in the chair beside her son. Jackson was still awake, his big eyes peeking over his blanket, when he saw Camille. Hi, Dr. Camille, he whispered. Hi, Jackson. She crouched beside his bed. How are you feeling? Good, he whispered back, his voice soft but cheerful. Mr. Bear says thank you for the stickers. Camille smiled, her chest warm. "You tell Mr. Bear he's welcome." Jackson reached out a small hand, wrapping it gently around Camille's fingers. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" "Yes," Camille promised. "I'll be here to check on you." Jackson grinned, his eyelids growing heavy. "Good. You're my hero, doctor." Camille stayed for a moment longer, watching as his breathing slowed, deep and peaceful. She rose quietly, her steps soft as she turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, Laura's voice stopped her. "Dr. Brooks?" Camille turned to see Laura sitting up, her expression uncertain. "Thank you," Laura said softly. Her voice wavered as though it wasn't used to such words. "For everything." Camille met her gaze and nodded. "It's my job, Mrs. Miller. I'm glad I can help." Laura hesitated before speaking again. "Jackson, he adores you." "He's a special boy," Camille replied gently. Laura looked away, her face unreadable in the dim light. Camille didn't press her. Some walls were slow to crumble, but Camille could feel it, just the faintest shift in the air. When Camille stepped into the hallway, she let out a quiet breath. Small kindnesses like cups of coffee, hesitant words of thanks, and the touch of a child's hand were enough to remind her that the climb was worth it. They weren't grand gestures, but sometimes the smallest things could build bridges over the widest divides. And for tonight, that was enough. The hospital halls were alive with their usual morning rhythm, the hum of movement, and the distant beeping of machines weaving together like background music. Camille moved through it with practiced focus, coffee cup in hand, her footsteps measured and steady. Today was different. Jackson's progress marked a significant step forward, and Camille hoped this would be his last full day in room 305. When she entered, Jackson was already wide awake. His coloring book lay open in his lap, and a small collection of stickers dotted his blanket. The boy's cheeks had regained their color, his eyes bright and full of life. "Good morning, Jackson," Camille greeted, her voice warm. "Dr. Camille," Jackson beamed. He held up his bear. "Mr. Bear says I'm going home soon." Camille chuckled softly, moving closer to his bed. "Mr. Bear is very smart." Laura, seated nearby, glanced up from the book she had been pretending to read. Her face looked softer these days, the tension around her eyes no longer so pronounced. "Is it true?" she asked hesitantly. "He can go home soon?" Camille nodded. "Yes. I want to do one final check today, but if everything looks good, Jackson can be discharged tomorrow." Laura's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank goodness. Jackson let out a celebratory giggle, wiggling under the blanket. "Did you hear that, Mommy? We're going home." Laura smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We heard, sweetheart." Greg entered the room just then, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. He looked around briefly before his gaze settled on Camille. "Morning." "Good morning," Camille replied evenly. Laura turned to him, her voice tinged with relief. "Dr. Brooks says Jackson can go home soon." Greg's lips pressed into a firm line, but his nod was clear. "Good." For a moment, the room was still. Greg's eyes flickered toward Jackson, who was now busy sticking colorful dinosaurs onto his bear's belly. The boy's contentment seemed to ground the room, his innocence a quiet barrier against the unspoken tension that still lingered between adults. "I'll need to run a few more tests to be certain," Camille said, "but so far, he's making great progress." "Thank you," Greg said, his tone stiff but not unkind. Camille met his gaze for just a beat longer, surprised again by the small crack she saw forming in his armor. He didn't look away like before. Instead, he held her gaze with something unfamiliar acknowledgement, maybe even respect, though buried beneath layers of discomfort. The afternoon passed in a blur of rounds and paperwork. When Camille returned to room 305 later to check on Jackson, the room felt noticeably different. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm golden lines across the floor. Jackson sat propped up against his pillows, a new drawing in his hands. Greg stood near the window, his hands shoved into his pockets, while Laura packed a few of Jackson's belongings into a small bag. "Dr. Camille!" Jackson called excitedly. "Look, I made this for you!" He held out the drawing, his tiny fingers smudged with crayon. Camille walked over, crouching down to take it from him. It was a picture of her again, this time with Jackson and Mr. Bear beside her. Bright, messy lines formed a wide sun overhead, and all of their faces wore big smiles. "This is wonderful, Jackson," Camille said softly, holding the paper as though it were something precious. Jackson beamed, his pride radiating off him like a glow. "Do you like it?" "I love it," Camille replied. "I'm going to put this up in my office so everyone can see it." Jackson giggled, his joy infectious. Greg, still near the window, turned slightly. For the first time, Camille saw the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Mommy says you take care of lots of kids," Jackson said, swinging his legs beneath the blanket. "I do," Camille replied with a smile. "And they are all brave, just like you." Jackson tilted his head thoughtfully. "Then I think you must be everyone's hero doctor." The words, spoken so innocently, hit Camille with unexpected force. Her throat tightened, her chest warm with something she couldn't quite name. Laura glanced up from packing, her eyes lingering on Camille for a moment longer than usual. "He really does adore you." Camille looked at Laura, her voice calm and genuine. "Jackson is a special boy." Greg shifted near the window, clearing his throat. "We'll, remember what you did for him." Camille turned toward him, surprised. His tone was awkward, as though the words were difficult to find. But they were there. "I'm glad I could help," she said, her voice steady. Greg didn't respond, but he nodded once, just enough to be noticeable. For Greg Miller, it felt like the equivalent of a handshake. That evening, as Camille sat in her office, she looked at Jackson's latest drawing pinned to the corkboard. Her wall of colorful, imperfect pictures had grown, each one a reminder of the children she had cared for, and the small lights they carried with them. Jackson's voice echoed in her mind. "Then I think you must be everyone's hero doctor." It wasn't about being a hero. Camille knew that. It was about showing up, day after day, for children like Jackson, children who needed her, who trusted her without question. And maybe, just maybe, for parents like the Millers, who had begun to see her differently, even if only a little. Camille leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. Evelyn's words from earlier in the week drifted through her thoughts. "Sometimes, people see you doing your work, your best work, and it shifts something." She didn't know if Greg and Laura Miller's views had changed, or if their gratitude would linger once they left the hospital. But she knew this. Jackson's light had cracked something open. It was fragile, barely visible, but it was real, and that was enough. The next morning, Camille stood at the nurse's station reviewing Jackson's discharge paperwork. Nurse Evelyn appeared at her side, a cup of coffee in hand. "Big day?" Evelyn asked, leaning casually against the counter. "Big day," Camille replied, signing off the final box on Jackson's chart. "He gets to go home." Evelyn smiled. "You'll miss him." Camille nodded, unable to hide her small smile. "I will, but he's ready." Evelyn studied her for a moment. "And the parents?" Camille paused, thoughtful. "They're getting there. Slowly." "Sometimes that's all you can hope for," Evelyn said, squeezing Camille's arm gently before walking away. In room 305, Jackson was practically bouncing with excitement as Camille entered with his discharge papers. Laura was helping him pack his toys, and Greg stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed but visibly relaxed for the first time. "Good morning, Jackson," Camille said. "Guess what? You're going home today." Jackson cheered, his voice filling the room. "Yay! Mr. Bear is ready too?" Camille handed Laura the papers. Here's everything you need for his discharge. I'll leave you with the nurses to go over the details." Laura accepted the papers with a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks, for everything." Greg stepped forward slightly, his gaze meeting Camille's. For the first time, his voice was softer, almost unsure. "Yeah, thank you." Camille smiled, her tone gentle but steady. "Take care of him. He's a special boy." Jackson stretched out his arms toward Camille. "Bye, Dr. Camille." She crouched beside him one last time, holding his tiny hand. "Be brave, Jackson. I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," he whispered. "You're my hero doctor." Camille rose slowly, her chest tight as she turned to leave. She paused just before the door, glancing back at the family. Greg stood with his hand resting on Jackson's shoulder, and for once there was no coldness in his gaze, only something close to gratitude. Camille stepped into the hallway, exhaling deeply. The fragile bridge she had helped build would remain unseen, but she knew it was there, and that was enough. Sometimes change began with a single light one, bright enough to soften even the hardest hearts. The following morning, the space Jackson once occupied in room 305 felt noticeably empty. Camille paused in the doorway, staring at the neat, stripped-down bed. For days, this room had been full of Jackson's laughter, his crayon drawings, and his innocent, radiant joy. Now, the silence felt stark, a strange emptiness that lingered in her chest. She stepped inside slowly, the sound of her heels soft against the floor. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with lingering traces of childlike sweetness, perhaps the leftover scent of juice boxes and Jackson's vanilla-scented shampoo. Camille picked up a forgotten dinosaur sticker from the bedside table, turning it over in her hands. "You miss him, don't you?" Camille turned to find Nurse Evelyn standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of humor and understanding. "Just a little," Camille admitted with a small smile. "Kids like Jackson, they stick with you." Evelyn crossed her arms as she stepped further into the room. "That boy adored you. You probably earned another wall full of drawings." "I think I did," Camille replied softly, carefully tucking the stray sticker into her coat pocket. It felt like a tiny keepsake, one last reminder of Jackson and his light. Evelyn leaned against the edge of the bed, studying Camille with her usual piercing gaze. "And his parents. Do you think they'll carry anything from this?" Camille hesitated, thoughtful. "Maybe. I saw something change at least. I think I did. Greg said thank you, and Laura, well, she tried." "That's more than I expected." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It doesn't happen overnight, Camille. People like the Millers don't unlearn years of baggage in a week, but sometimes it's enough to plant a seed." Camille nodded, her fingers brushing against the sticker in her pocket. "It's strange. Even after all the doubt, all the tension, they left me something too. Jackson's innocence made it hard to hold on to all that anger." Evelyn gave her a knowing look. "You're good at this, you know? Not just the medicine, this. Seeing people for what they are, even when they don't deserve it." "Sometimes it feels like too much," Camille murmured, her voice quieter. "And yet you keep showing up," Evelyn said firmly. "That's how you change people, Camille. One kid, one moment, one crack in the armor at a time." Camille exhaled slowly, the weight of Evelyn's words settling over her. She offered a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks, Evelyn. You always know what to say." "Don't mention it," Evelyn replied, pushing herself off the bed. "Now come on. Room 312 has a little girl with a sore throat who's already asking for stickers." Camille smiled, following Evelyn out of room 305. Even as she walked down the hall, she couldn't help but look back one last time. It felt like leaving something unfinished, yet somehow whole. The days passed quickly. With Jackson gone, Camille threw herself into her work rounding on patients, consulting with nurses, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But at odd moments, her mind would wander back to the Millers. She wondered if Jackson was still bouncing around with his stuffed bear, his bright eyes and toothy smile lighting up their home. She wondered if Laura had settled back into her routines and if Greg had softened even the slightest bit. Her thoughts were often fleeting, just passing questions, but they lingered long enough to remind her of the fragility of change. One afternoon, as Camille sat reviewing patient charts, Evelyn poked her head into the office. "Delivery for you." Camille looked up, eyebrows raising. "Delivery?" Evelyn entered with a small brown envelope, placing it on Camille's desk with a theatrical flourish. "Looks personal." Camille's chest tightened. She picked up the envelope and turned it over in her hands, her name scrawled on the front in slightly uneven handwriting. She knew that handwriting. Jackson. Carefully she opened it. Inside was a crayon drawing folded neatly in half. It showed Jackson and Mr. Bear standing in a field of flowers, Camille beside them, wearing her white coat. Above their heads, Jackson had written in bright, wobbly letters, "Thank you, Dr. Camille, from Jackson and Mr. Bear." Camille smiled, her throat tight as she traced the letters with her thumb. Beneath the drawing was a small note in a different handwriting, Laura's. "Dr. Brooks, thank you for everything you did for Jackson. We'll never forget your kindness. You gave us our son back, and that means more than we can ever say. Jackson still talks about you every day. He says you're his hero doctor. You made a difference not just for him, but for us too. Laura Miller." Camille set the note down slowly, the weight of those words settling deep in her chest. She had never expected anything more from the Millers. Their gratitude, while unspoken for days, had been enough when they left. But this felt different. It wasn't just a thank you. It was proof of something greater. Evelyn leaned against the doorway, watching her quietly. "Good news?" Camille held up the drawing, her smile faint but warm. "Jackson sent me a letter." Evelyn's face lit up. "The little fighter himself?" Camille nodded, handing Evelyn the note to read. Evelyn scanned it quickly, a soft smile touching her lips. "Well, I'll be. Looks like you got through to them after all." "Maybe," Camille said, her voice soft. "Maybe Jackson got through to them too." Evelyn handed the note back, shaking her head in quiet admiration. "You know, Camille, it's kids like Jackson who remind us what's good in the world. They see people for who they really are. No walls, no baggage, just kindness." Camille nodded, looking back down at the drawing. "I needed this today," she admitted. Evelyn smiled. "Hang it up. Let it remind you that what you do matters." "I think I will," Camille replied. Evelyn lingered for a moment longer before leaving Camille alone with her thoughts. She stared at Jackson's drawing, then carefully pinned it to her wall beside the others. It fit perfectly, a splash of color, in a room so often filled with quiet determination. Camille leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The cracks she had seen in Greg's armor, the hesitant kindness in Laura's voice, it hadn't been in vain. She hadn't just treated Jackson's illness. She had been part of something bigger. She thought of her father's words, ones she had clung to for years. "Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt." Jackson's note was proof that it had. That evening, as Camille left the hospital, the sky above the city had turned a dusky purple, the horizon streaked with soft orange light. She paused at the entrance, looking out at the world beyond the hospital's walls. It felt like a small victory, one no one else would see, but one that mattered deeply. Jackson's innocence, his trust, had shifted something invisible, yet real. Maybe Greg and Laura would still carry parts of their old bias, but Jackson had shown them another way, another light. And Camille would keep showing up for kids like him, day after day, as long as they needed her. Sometimes, change began with the smallest hands, the brightest smiles, and the most fragile cracks. And sometimes, that was enough. It had been a week since Jackson Miller was discharged. The steady hum of hospital life carried on, but for Camille, Something about those days felt quieter, less strained. She had pinned Jackson's latest drawing on her office wall, a daily reminder that even the smallest moments could ripple outward in unexpected ways. As Camille rounded the pediatric ward that morning, she paused briefly by room 305. It was occupied again, this time by a teenage girl recovering from surgery. The room itself was no different, same white walls, same mechanical hum of machines, but Camille felt its absence. It was as though Jackson's energy had left a mark, invisible yet impossible to ignore. She shook off the thought and turned her attention to the day ahead. Hours later, as Camille reviewed paperwork at the nurse's station, a voice startled her from behind. "Dr. Brooks?" Camille turned, surprised to see Laura Miller standing there, clutching a small paper bag in her hands. She looked different, less rigid, less guarded, though the nerves were still evident in her posture. "Mrs. Miller," Camille said, masking her surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." Laura smiled faintly, shifting the bag nervously. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I thought about it all week, and well, I needed to drop this off." She handed Camille the bag, her hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" Camille asked gently, taking it. "It's just cookies," Laura replied quickly, as though embarrassed. "Jackson and I made them yesterday. He insisted we bring you some." Camille paused, the paper bag warm in her hands. "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." Laura's smile faltered, and she looked down, seemingly searching for words. "He still talks about you, you know. Every day. He told his kindergarten teacher all about his hero doctor." Camille's heart softened. "That means a lot." Laura exhaled sharply, her voice quieter now. "I wanted to say something about before." Camille waited, giving her space. Laura hesitated, swallowing hard. "I think I owe you an apology. The way we treated you, it wasn't fair. You gave Jackson everything you had, and we—" She broke off, her hands twisting together. "We let our own ignorance get in the way." Camille felt the weight of those words settle over her. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Mrs. Miller," she said carefully, her tone soft but firm, "it's not easy to face things we've carried for a long time, but Jackson's light, it's hard to ignore." Laura blinked, her eyes shining with emotion. "He sees the world differently. I see that now. And maybe it's time we learn to see it differently too." Camille nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's never too late to try." Laura wiped at her cheek quickly, as though embarrassed. "Anyway, I should go. I just wanted to say thank you again." "Tell Jackson I said hello," Camille replied gently. "And thank you for the cookies." Laura offered a small, genuine smile before turning and walking away. Camille stood there for a moment, the bag of cookies still warm in her hands. She let out a slow breath, the edges of her heart softening. People didn't often change overnight, but this felt like proof of something real. That afternoon, Camille sat in the break room with Nurse Evelyn, both of them sharing the cookies Laura had brought. "These are good," Evelyn said, her mouth full. "Did you bake them?" "Not me," Camille replied with a faint laugh. "Jackson and his mom made them." Evelyn paused mid-bite, her eyebrows raising. "Jackson's mom. She brought these?" Camille nodded. "She came by earlier to thank me. It wasn't easy for her to say, but I think it meant something." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, chewing thoughtfully. "Well, you really did it, didn't you?" Camille looked at her, confused. "Did what?" "You didn't just save Jackson, you cracked something open in his parents, too." Evelyn gestured with a cookie. "You kept showing up, Camille. That's what makes the difference." Camille smiled faintly, staring down at the crumbs on her napkin. "I didn't think it would." "Not really." Evelyn shook her head. "You'd be surprised how much one moment one person can shift things. You planted a seed, whether you meant to or not." And Jackson? He's the water. The thought settled into Camille's chest, heavy and warm all at once. That evening, as Camille packed up to leave, she found herself pausing by her office wall. Jackson's colorful drawing was still front and center, a smiling doctor surrounded by sunshine, with Jackson and Mr. Bear right beside her. Next to it was a second, smaller picture, a rainbow crayon scribble that had arrived in the same envelope as Laura's letter. Camille traced the outline of Jackson's words. "Thank you, Dr. Camille." She thought of Laura's visit earlier, of the quiet sincerity in her voice. She thought of Greg, whose silence had shifted to a gruff thank you that day they left the hospital. It wasn't a complete change, but it was the beginning of something. And sometimes, beginnings were enough. When Camille stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her. The sky had begun to darken, streaked with soft hues of pink and orange as the day bled into night. She paused in the hospital parking lot, breathing deeply as she let the day settle into her bones. Her thoughts lingered on Jackson, on his innocence, his trust, his unfiltered joy. Children like him had a way of reminding her of the goodness in people, even when it seemed buried beneath layers of doubt and fear. Maybe Greg and Laura Miller hadn't realized it yet, but Jackson had already changed them. His love, his light, it had softened the edges of their world. And through it all, Camille had simply been there to help guide them toward it. She thought of her father's words again. "Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt." Camille smiled softly, turning her gaze toward the horizon. The work was hard, tiring in ways most people couldn't see, but it was worth it. Jackson had proven that. As she got into her car and started the engine, Camille found herself looking forward to tomorrow. There would be new patients, new challenges, and maybe new cracks to open in walls that seemed unmovable. And if it meant making a difference one child, one family at a time, she would keep showing up. Because sometimes, kindness didn't just heal the body. It healed hearts too. And even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out, reaching places she'd never see. The days following Laura Miller's visit slipped into a familiar rhythm: rounds, paperwork, and the steady hum of hospital life. Camille found herself falling back into the quiet comfort of routine. But no matter how busy her day grew, Jackson's crayon drawing on her office wall never failed to catch her eye. She would often pause, even just for a second, to take it in. The bright sun, the smiling faces, Jackson's innocent handwriting. "Thank you, Dr. Camille." It was more than a drawing. It was a reminder that change, no matter how slow or fragile, could happen when you least expected it. That Thursday afternoon, as Camille finished updating a patient chart at the nurse's station, Nurse Evelyn appeared at her side. "You've got visitors," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement. Camille frowned slightly, looking up. "Visitors?" Evelyn gestured toward the pediatric waiting area down the hall. "See for yourself." Curious, Camille tucked the chart under her arm and headed toward the waiting area. When she turned the corner, she stopped short. Sitting there, in two chairs side by side, were Laura and Greg Miller. Camille blinked, surprise rippling through her. Laura noticed her first and stood quickly, brushing imaginary lint off her jeans. She looked less put together than the last time Camille had seen her, her hair loose, her face tired, but there was something gentler about her now. Greg sat beside her, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He looked different, too. His usual stiff posture was relaxed, his shoulders less burdened. When he looked up and met Camille's gaze, there was no anger or suspicion in his eyes, just something Camille couldn't quite name. "Dr. Brooks," Laura said, her voice soft, "I hope we're not interrupting." Camille shook off her surprise and offered a polite smile. "Not at all. What brings you here?" Greg stood as well, clearing his throat awkwardly. "We brought someone to see you." Before Camille could ask who, she heard the familiar sound of tiny feet pattering against the floor. "Dr. Camille!" Her heart jumped as Jackson came bounding out from around the corner, his stuffed bear tucked tightly under his arm. His curls bounced with every step, his face split into a wide, uncontainable grin. "Jackson!" Camille exclaimed, crouching as he barreled straight into her arms. She caught him easily, his little arms wrapping tightly around her neck. "I missed you," Jackson said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Camille smiled as warmth spread through her chest. "I missed you too, buddy. Look at you. You look so much better." Jackson pulled back, beaming as he held up his bear. "Mr. Bear missed you too," Camille laughed, brushing a hand over his curls. "I'm glad you're both doing well." Laura stepped closer, her expression softer than Camille had ever seen it. "He's been asking about you every day since we left. He wanted to come say hello." Camille glanced at Greg, who was watching the scene quietly. "Thank you for bringing him." Greg shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to stay present. "He wouldn't let it go," he admitted with a faint smile. "Told us you needed to see how strong he's gotten." "Well," Camille said, turning back to Jackson, "you do look very strong. How have you been feeling?" "Good!" Jackson exclaimed proudly. "Mommy says I'm all better, and I'm eating lots of vegetables so I can stay strong like a bear." "That's what I like to hear," Camille replied, her smile lingering. A short while later, Camille found herself sitting with the Millers and Jackson in the hospital's small family waiting area. Jackson was sprawled out on the carpeted floor with his bear and a new box of crayons the nurses had given him. As he colored happily, the adults sat together, their conversation tentative but genuine. "Jackson really does look great," Camille said, breaking the silence. Laura nodded. "He's back to his usual self, running around the house, drawing all day. It's hard to believe how sick he was just last week." Camille turned to Greg. "And how are you holding up?" Greg looked startled by the question, as though no one had thought to ask him that before. He scratched the back of his neck, his voice lower than usual. "We're good. Better." He glanced at Jackson, his expression softening. "It makes you look at things differently when you almost lose them." Laura shifted slightly, folding her hands in her lap. "Jackson hasn't stopped talking about you, Dr. Brooks. You really made an impression on him." Camille smiled faintly, warmth spreading through her chest again. "Jackson's a special boy. It's hard not to be affected by him." Laura hesitated, her voice quieter now. "And on us too." Camille looked up, meeting her gaze. The words hung in the air unspoken and fragile, but she heard them clearly. "We're trying. We're learning." Greg spoke next, surprising her. "I don't think I ever said it right that day." He shifted, uncomfortable but determined to continue. "Thank you. You saved our boy, and I didn't make it easy for you." Camille studied him for a long moment, her heart steady. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job," she replied softly. "It's not just that," Greg admitted, his voice quieter now. "I judged you before I knew you, before I saw what you did for Jackson." The confession hung between them, heavy and raw. Laura's hand found Greg's, her fingers curling around his in quiet support. Camille chose her words carefully. "It's not easy to change the way we see the world, but you gave me a chance to care for Jackson, and that's what mattered most." Greg nodded, his gaze dropping to his son, who was humming softly as he colored. "He doesn't see the world the way we did," Greg said, almost to himself. "And maybe that's a good thing." Laura smiled faintly. "It is a good thing." The silence that followed wasn't strained or awkward. It was full of something else: acknowledgement, understanding, and the faint beginnings of hope. As the afternoon wore on, Jackson climbed back into Laura's lap, his eyes heavy with the promise of an afternoon nap. "I think someone's ready to head home," Laura said, smoothing his curls. Jackson's head lolled against her shoulder as he mumbled sleepily, "Bye, Dr. Camille." Camille leaned in, brushing her hand gently over his small back. "Take care of Mr. Bear for me, okay?" "I will," he whispered, already halfway asleep. Laura and Greg rose to their feet, gathering their things as they prepared to leave. Before they turned to go, Laura hesitated. "Thank you again, Dr. Brooks, for everything." Greg followed her, pausing for just a beat longer. He looked at Camille and gave a short, firm nod. "Take care, Doc." Camille nodded back. "You too." She stood there for a long moment after they left, staring at the empty space where they had been. In the corner, Jackson's last drawing sat on the table, a rainbow sun with bright blue grass and scribbled stick figures. Camille picked it up, smiling as she folded it gently. Another keepsake. That evening, as Camille sat at her desk, she carefully pinned Jackson's newest drawing to the wall. Her collection had grown over the years, but Jackson's pictures stood out the most. She leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift over the wall of color, each crayon line a story, a victory, a moment that mattered. Her father's voice echoed softly in her memory. "Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt." It had. And today, she thought, her work had done more than heal a child. It had built a fragile bridge, one small enough to go unnoticed, but strong enough to carry change. Camille smiled, feeling the quiet weight of it all settle in her heart. For Jackson, for his parents, and for herself, this was enough, and it always would be. The rain fell softly outside, its rhythm a quiet backdrop to the hospital's steady hum. Drops gathered on the window of Camille's small office, trailing down the glass like silver threads. She sat at her desk, tapping a pen lightly against the paper in front of her, her thoughts lingering on the unexpected visit from the Millers just days ago. Jackson's crayon drawing hung proudly on her wall, alongside his earlier masterpieces. The simple, smiling figures in bright colors stood out in the sterile office space, a small reminder of innocence, of hope, of what she worked for every day. There was no denying it. Jackson had left a mark, not just on his parents, but on Camille too. Mid-morning, Camille was making her rounds when Nurse Evelyn found her near the nurse's station. "You're in demand again, Dr. Brooks," Evelyn teased, handing over a small note. Camille raised an eyebrow as she took it. "What is it now?" "Not a new patient," Evelyn said, leaning against the counter. "A phone call. Someone's asking for you by name." Camille frowned slightly, glancing at the note. "Laura Miller." "She called the hospital?" Camille asked, surprised. Evelyn shrugged. "Sounds like she wants to talk to you. I transferred her to your office line." Camille nodded, her curiosity growing as she turned toward her office. She wondered what Laura might want. Jackson had been doing well when they last saw each other, his energy returning, his laughter infectious. Maybe she just wanted to check in, Camille thought. Or maybe something more. When Camille reached her office, she closed the door behind her and picked up the phone. "This is Dr. Brooks," Camille said, her voice calm, as she settled into her chair. "Hi, Dr. Brooks. It's Laura Miller." Laura's voice came through the line, steady but tentative, as though she still wasn't used to reaching out. "Hello, Mrs. Miller," Camille replied softly. "How are you? And how's Jackson?" "Oh, he's great," Laura said quickly, the warmth in her voice unmistakable. "Back to being his usual self, drawing, running around the house, talking nonstop about how he's strong like a bear." Camille smiled, leaning back in her chair. "That's wonderful to hear. I'm glad he's doing so well." There was a pause on the line, long enough for Camille to hear the faint sound of rain in the background. "That's actually why I'm calling," Laura said eventually. "Jackson's teacher at school is organizing a family day next weekend. Jackson's been telling everyone about you, about his hero doctor. He asked if you could come." Camille blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Yes," Laura said, her voice earnest now. "It's nothing big, just a little gathering for the kids and families at his school. But Jackson insisted. He wants you to meet everyone." Camille hesitated, her heart softening. She could imagine Jackson now, his bright eyes lighting up as he told his friends stories about Mr. Bear and the hero doctor who made him feel better. "You don't have to say yes," Laura added quickly. "I know you're busy. I thought I'd ask." Camille smiled faintly, warmth spreading through her chest. "I would love to come, Mrs. Miller. If Jackson wants me there, I'll be there." Laura exhaled audibly, relief clear in her voice. "Thank you. He'll be so happy." "It's my pleasure," Camille said softly. There was another pause, quieter this time. "And Dr. Brooks?" Laura's voice wavered slightly. "I meant what I said before. You've changed the way we see things. Jackson's always been our light, but you helped us see it more clearly. I don't think we'll ever be able to thank you enough." Camille's throat tightened, her voice steady but soft. "You already have, Mrs. Miller." When the call ended, Camille sat quietly for a long moment, the line's hum replaced by the soft patter of rain on her window. She stared at Jackson's crayon drawings on the wall, their bright simplicity cutting through the gloom of the day. He had been a light for her, too. The following weekend, Camille found herself in the parking lot of Jackson's school, clutching a small gift bag in her hand. Inside was a new stuffed bear, smaller than Jackson's well-loved one, but identical in every other way. She had wrapped it carefully in bright paper, imagining Jackson's excitement. As she stepped through the school's gymnasium doors, the sound of laughter and chatter washed over her. Families clustered around tables, children darted between stations, and the smell of popcorn and lemonade lingered in the air. Camille scanned the crowd, spotting Laura almost immediately. She stood near a group of parents, smiling warmly when she caught sight of Camille. "You made it," Laura said, approaching her quickly. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't miss it," Camille replied. "Where's Jackson?" Before Laura could answer, a familiar voice rang out. "Dr. Camille!" Camille turned just in time to see Jackson sprinting toward her, his face breaking into a radiant smile. He crashed into her legs, hugging her tightly. "You're here!" Jackson cried, his voice full of joy. "Mommy said you'd come, but I didn't believe her." "I wouldn't miss seeing my favorite little fighter," Camille said, crouching to his level. "I brought you something too." She handed him the bag, watching as he tore the paper away. His eyes widened when he saw the new bear, his grin impossibly bright. "Mr. Bear too," Jackson declared, holding the stuffed animal up proudly. Camille laughed, ruffling his curls. "Now Mr. Bear has a friend." Greg appeared then, standing a few steps behind Laura. His expression was unreadable at first, but as he watched Jackson chatter excitedly with Camille, something softened in his features. He walked over, clearing his throat. "Dr. Brooks," Greg said. His voice, though gruff, carried none of the old tension. "Good to see you again." Camille stood, smiling faintly. "Good to see you, too." Greg's gaze lingered on Jackson for a moment, before he looked back at Camille. "I'm glad you came. It means a lot to him." "And to us," Laura added quietly. Camille nodded, her heart steady and full. "It means a lot to me, too." The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and games. Jackson introduced Camille to his friends and his teacher, proudly declaring her his hero doctor at every opportunity. Camille humored him with soft laughter, letting his joy carry her through the day. As the event wound down and families began to leave, Camille stood at the edge of the gymnasium, watching as Jackson ran circles around his parents, his new bear clutched tightly in his arms. Laura caught Camille's eye and smiled, her expression open in a way Camille hadn't seen before. Greg gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Camille stayed a moment longer, letting the scene wash over her. This family, this moment wasn't perfect. There were still cracks, still walls that might take time to fully break, but they were trying, and sometimes trying was enough. That evening, as Camille sat in her quiet office, She looked at the new crayon drawing Jackson had given her that afternoon. In it, she stood with Jackson and his bears, all of them surrounded by hearts and stars. She pinned it next to the others, staring at the growing collection on her wall. Her father's words echoed in her mind one last time. "Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt." Camille leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the day settle in her chest. Change wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it came in the form of a child's smile, a simple thank you, or a family that saw the world differently because of one small light. And as long as there were children like Jackson, Camille knew she would keep showing up. One patient, one moment, one light at a time. Camille stepped out of the hospital that evening, the air cool and crisp as the sky turned a deep indigo. For the first time in a while, she let herself pause, taking in the stillness of the world around her. It wasn't always the big victories that defined her work. Sometimes it was the smallest moments. Moments like Jackson's smile, Laura's words of gratitude, and the quiet respect in Greg's eyes. As she walked to her car, Camille slipped a hand into her coat pocket, feeling the familiar edges of the crumpled dinosaur sticker Jackson had given her that first week. She smiled softly, holding it for a moment, before tucking it back. Her father had been right all those years ago. Let your work speak louder than anyone's doubt. Jackson had reminded her why she kept going, why she showed up, no matter how uphill the climb felt. Because sometimes, all it took was one child, one family, to prove that kindness could heal more than bodies. It could heal hearts, too, and as long as there was a light to carry, she would carry it. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. Dr. Camille's journey reminds us all that even small acts of kindness can ripple out in ways we never expect. If this story touched you, inspired you, or gave you a moment of reflection, I hope you'll join us for more. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Together, we can keep spreading light, one story at a time. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next one.